Huron? Thank you. Hi, welcome back to class. Normally at this time, what I'll probably do in future weeks is do a little bit of discussion based on the email stuff we get from the discussion list. Frankly, I'm not really that far along. I did send out some questions to some people regarding Vietnamese history, what the traits were, and a couple people wrote back about the relationship with China, and made the point that the United States really never understood this as we'll see. The U.S. always saw kind of the Vietnamese and the Chinese as one and the same. When in fact, if you know anything about Vietnamese history, they're obviously quite different. The Vietnamese are never going to be puppets of China. So a lot of people commented on that, and what I'll normally do, and in fact maybe next class or the one after that, we can begin by talking about that a little bit more, but right now we're still kind of not quite at the period of the 20th century yet where the U.S. comes in. But some of those emails I think really kind of hit on the major thrust of Vietnamese history. When you talk about the Vietnamese in the early period, you see these fairly overt, fairly clear strains running through it, the nationalism, the resistance, and of course the relationship with the Chinese. Okay, and we talked about that at some length. Now we're going to talk about the Europeans, and we'll see many of those same dynamics. As I said, the Portuguese were the first to attempt to come into Indochina and establish control, but it's the French who actually succeed. A French fleet with some Spanish ships, 14 in all, with about 3,000 troops, seizes Da Nang. Da Nang is along the coast. You could, actually I can fairly quickly, I think, go back to the map here. You probably know where Da Nang is anyway, but it's along the coast here, and of course right there. Okay, you can see it's in the Central Highlands area right there. This will also be where the American troops, when they get to Vietnam, land in 1965. So this is the first European, French invasion as well at Da Nang along the coastline in the central region in Annam. And the French come in and seize it. Now the French have two particular goals in Vietnam. They're going to force a great deal of concessions upon the Vietnamese. One, of course, is economic. They want, and that's the most important one, they want to establish Vietnam as a trading outlet. They will establish rubber plantations there. They will use it for raw materials, especially for labor, for as a consumer market too. Okay, and another reason is they want to punish the Vietnamese because Vietnam is a Buddhist country, and Vietnam's Catholics feel persecuted because the Buddhists are running Vietnamese society. But the biggest reason is that the Vietnamese have not opened their the Vietnamese have not opened the national economy to outside forces. They're not permitting adequate trade. The Europeans are not able to get a foothold in the Vietnamese markets the way they would. And the French are hoping that a foothold in Vietnam could bring them control of the Mekong. Again, let me quickly go back to the map there. One of the French goals, and of course they never reached this, is to get control of the Mekong, and then use this as a trading route all the way up through Cambodia, through Laos, into China. Again, it's the old kind of the Marco Polo syndrome. So that's the French goal is to have access to ultimately the Chinese market. The China market's a huge, huge issue throughout the 19th century. I mean, the Americans buy into it as well. It becomes really kind of mythic. China's population obviously is always huge. It's always the biggest in the world, and so if you can get access to that China market, can you imagine the profits you can make? In the early 20th century, Americans used to say, just, if everyone in China bought one bottle of Coke every day, can you imagine how much profit you'd make? And this is kind of what the French are thinking. We can get into Vietnam, we can get access to the Mekong, we can go up, and we can sell rubber, tin, tungsten, whatever, okay? Moet Chandon, you name it. So this is their idea, and of course it doesn't work, but the fact of the matter is it's a motivating force, so it's very important that way. They want access to the China market. So Vietnam is clearly a direct target, but the bigger potential target ultimately will be China. So this is the French plan, and with this plan, the Vietnamese decide to basically take a fairly heavy-handed approach. The French take a fairly heavy-handed approach to the Vietnamese. French colonialism in Vietnam, which lasts less than a century, is really oppressive. I mean, the stories of the French colonial empire in Indochina are quite brutal. They're every bit as bad as the stories you will hear about the British in India, or the Germans in Africa, or the French in Algeria, or wherever else. It's a really oppressive, brutal system. They establish rubber plantations in which the Vietnamese essentially, are indentured servants, almost like slaves. They're forced to do work in these rubber plantations, very, very difficult, brutal work. The public works in Vietnam are done by Vietnamese under something called a corvée labor system. I'm not sure if that's where the accent goes, so I fail French class today probably. Corvée labor means that you take the locals and you force them. Well, basically you tax them. They can't pay their taxes, so rather than go to debtor prison, you establish a corvée labor system. You take people who are in arrears on their tax payments and you force them to build roads, to build bridges, to do public works. Okay, so they establish a corvée labor system too, and this is often going to be a, yeah.
The French did the same thing in Africa.
Yeah. Oh, they're doing it throughout the colonies. Yeah, the corvée labor is the way most of the undeveloped world is initially built up. They force they create indebtedness, and then they force these people in lieu of debtor's prison to build up an infrastructure, which they, of course, will benefit from. I mean, the Vietnamese don't need roads. They're not driving cars. They're not going to have trains or anything. It's going to be the French who want roads in order to have commercial routes. Okay? So they establish a corvée labor system, which can be quite backbreaking. This is going to be a cause of uprising intermittently, where groups of people, I mean, Ho Chi Minh, when he emerges, sees people in his home region doing corvée labor, and this has a huge impact on him throughout the rest of his life. So the French behavior toward the Vietnamese is quite repressive. It's on a par with the other colonial powers in that period. So this is the French plan, is to force these concessions on Vietnam, and to do that they initially move south. Now we've talked about China in the north, in the Tonkin region, because they share that border. The French seat of operations, though, was in the south, in the Saigon area, and the southern part was called Cochin, China. And the capital, of course, is Saigon. Quite often you will see Vietnamese words written either as one word or syllabically. So Saigon can be like this, S-A-I, capital G-O-N, or it might just be Saigon. Near as I can tell, both are correct. As I said, I don't speak Vietnamese, so you will see them both ways, and both, I'm assuming, are just fine. This is the Vietnamese seat of operations. Saigon's the capital, and they are strong in Cochin, China, which is in the southernmost third of Vietnam. Remember, Tonkin is in the north. Annam is in the central region, and then Cochin, China is in the south. And of course, to the west are Cambodia and Laos. And actually later on I'll show you a map of that region again, a different map. Cochin, China becomes the center of French operations in Indochina. Cochin, China is the capital. Cochin, China is the area where the French have the most collaborators among the Vietnamese. Conversely, it's the north, Tonkin and Annam, which are the most anti-French, where the French are the most hated. Not surprisingly, then, in both the French and the American wars, known as the First and Second Indochina Wars, it's going to be the south that is the area that's most closely identified with the French, and then the Americans, not the north. So the French immediately establish a base of operations in the south, in the Cochin China region, and they crack down on the Vietnamese. They force concessions. They begin military campaigns. By 1861, 1862, the French are forcing the Vietnamese to make these concessions. They force the French to give they force the Vietnamese to give them, the French, control of several provinces. Bien Hoa, these are in the south, in the Cochin China region. Bien Hoa, Gia Dinh, and Din Thuong. You don't have to know them. They demand that the French allow them to proselytize Catholicism, that they bring missionaries in and begin to try to convert the local peoples who tend to have, they're Buddhist or they have some kind of indigenous or animist religion. The French and the Spanish, who are linked together by a royal marriage in Europe. The French and the Spanish force the Vietnamese to give them trading rights, especially at Da Nang along the coast and elsewhere. Da Nang tends to be one of the major ports because it's right there, central Vietnam along the South China Sea. And this is kind of perhaps the most shocking, the Vietnamese are forced to pay the French for the military campaigns that they waged against them. So the Vietnamese have to pay the French for the military campaigns that attack them, right? So the Vietnamese are paying for the war against themselves. The French will enforce these concessions with all their power. They will do this violently. They will slaughter the Vietnamese fairly mercilessly. The French have far superior firepower. And the Vietnamese, throughout every war they fought, took disproportionately greater losses than their enemy. Even though they win, they lost many, many more people. The Vietnamese balked at this, of course. They called the French white-skinned barbarians. And they laughed at the idea that European society was civilized and advanced, and the East was allegedly backward and corrupt, when in fact the type of stuff the French were doing, was horrific, as bad as anything the Chinese, clearly as bad as anything the Chinese had ever done. In fact, they believed the Chinese were in a sense more noble. Because of this, then, you immediately see a resistance develop, but that's not universal. There's also a collaboration. So the story of the French period, and this is important, is that the Vietnamese resist. No one did a Gallup poll. I would suspect that most Vietnamese didn't want the French there. That's probably a fairly easy call, just as most Vietnamese don't want the Americans there. Again, it's a fairly easy call. But there are a fair number, especially of the elites, who do work closely with the French because it's within their interests to do so, and they're collaborators. So when you deal with this period, you see resistance and collaboration. You have to talk about both of them because they're really part of the same process. Almost immediately, in the 1860s, you start to see this Vietnamese tradition of protest from the Truong sisters and Lady Truong, Tran Hung Dao, and the Tai Son emerge again. So local groups form immediately to oppose the French. And they have a variety of banners. They have placards that say, "Pacify the French, wipe out heresy, people self-defense," stuff like that. In the Mekong, in the southern region, which it's kind of funny, even during the Vietnam War, when the Americans had control over South Vietnam, the area where the enemy, the Viet Minh and Viet Cong influence was strongest was in the Mekong. The Mekong was teeming with VC because they were close to Saigon and they hated the government so much. So and that was nothing new. That had been in the process for over 100 years already. The Mekong was the area where resistance was the greatest. A great deal of heroism, but again, no technology to actually have a feasible defense. In addition to that, the Vietnamese really were kind of isolated from the Western world. And when the French come in, the Vietnamese don't understand just how strong and powerful and technologically advanced the French are. And so they really were not cognizant of what they were up against in the initial years of this resistance, and so they're essentially getting slaughtered. Yeah.
Did I understand you correctly to say that the Mekong was traditionally and continued to be a seat of resistance?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, this is even during the American War. They could never pacify the Mekong. The Saigon, 40, 50 miles outside Saigon, the VC controlled much of the countryside, right outside the capital of the RVN, of South Vietnam. There's always an area rife with protest. It's an unusual dynamic, but it comes out of the French period because that was the French capital. Just as, that's the reason that Tonkin was so radical when the Chinese were there, because the Chinese were at Hanoi. So around Hanoi you have the biggest resistance. Well, the people in Hanoi, remain opposed to the French, but the Mekong area does as well.
So then we find Saigon in the Mekong area?
Not far.
But close enough that what you say is so.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. So you start to see then resistance on a fairly broad scale. One of the kind of interesting things about Vietnam is that this resistance, we've talked about the martial spirit in Vietnam, which is quite noticeable, quite overt. There's this kind of virile martial patriotism. I mean, I think it's really an interesting kind of comparison to see like JFK and Ho Chi Minh, because Kennedy was kind of like that in the 60s, this kind of, macho, testosterone-ridden, approach to the world. And you see that in the Vietnamese too. There's this kind of martial, virile patriotism, but at the same time, a huge element in their resistance is going to be quite beautiful. It's going to be based on words, and especially poetry. The only thing in American history I can compare to that would be something like Thomas Paine's Common Sense, or maybe Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin. But you don't see that often in the U.S., where words and writings have such vitality. You see that a fair amount in Asia, actually, things like the Democracy Wall in China, or especially with the Vietnamese. So among the leaders in this initial resistance are a lot of poets. I should go back to the Vietnamese. We talked a little bit about their cultural heritage and their legacy. This is just an artist's imagery of a Vietnamese warrior. And again, this kind of imagery is quite common and idealized. The Vietnamese warrior fighting against these very difficult odds, taking on this very powerful enemy. So these kinds of images are very common. But in addition to that, you start to see a lot of poetry appear. A lot of famous poets. One of the first was Nguyen Dinh Chu. And protest literature, and especially poetry, appears basically as soon as the French arrive. I mean, the Vietnamese have a tradition and a history of this. They don't have to prepare to oppose this invading force. They're used to it. They've been doing it already for, 2,000 years. So Nguyen Dinh Chu goes after the French. He hates the French, but in addition to that, he goes after collaborators. Those who do not fight against the French, those who cooperate with the French, are his main target. And a lot of Vietnamese believe that the French, they're an invading army. You expect that from them, but the Vietnamese who work with the French, who cooperate and collaborate, are really the evil ones. And this is going to be a common thread. I'm going to read several different poems and parts of that. And this is going to be a common thread. It's the Vietnamese who participate with the French who are really to be reviled. And Nguyen Dinh Chu believes that. He can't understand how some Vietnamese want to, kind of Francicize themselves to become like the French, to participate in them. He himself refuses any contact with Western things. He won't even use soap powder because it's Western. People said he refused to walk on paved roads because they were built by the French with corvée labor. He did not allow his children to learn the Romanized alphabet. So Nguyen Dinh Chu and many others like him really resent this. They believe, again, in a renaissance of Vietnamese culture, this reminds one of the Tai San, which was barely a century before that. When poets like Nguyen Dinh Chu looked at the world, you were kind of either for us or against us. There was basically a polarized version. You either believed in traditional values or you rejected them. So he wrote a poem about this, which talked about some of the values we talked about just a few minutes ago. The poem says, "The way of heaven is not at all remote. Wash a human heart, and out it comes. How can a man of Nha, righteousness, betray his country? How can a man of Nha reject family feelings? The path to choose is always that of Trung and Hue, loyalty and family piety. Our books distinguish clearly between truth and heresy." So when he says the path to choose is the path of righteousness, the path of loyalty, the path of filial piety, they may be talking about the family, but in the larger context, what's he talking about? It's the country, rejecting the French, choosing that path. And he took on his countrymen all the time. He pours scorn on those who don't resist enough. One poem he wrote, which is really remarkable. I can't imagine that Nguyen Dinh Chu ever read Karl Marx or vice versa. Yet Nguyen Dinh Chu writes a poem and he says, "Our people are infatuated with Western religion. And if one isn't anesthetized with faith, there is always opium to smoke. Some clutch their pipes day and night, eating opium to suppress rebellion." I mean, this is clear. Marx said, religion was the opium of the masses, linking the two. And Nguyen Dinh Chu sees this in Vietnam. I mean, this is a period not that long after the Opium Wars, where the British waged war against China to force them to essentially, create a country of addicts. So, and in copying the Chinese elite, the Vietnamese do it too. They smoke opium, and Catholicism is coming in. And Nguyen Dinh Chu says these are attempts to suppress rebellion, clearly establishing cultural links in Vietnamese life. He's appalled by this. This idea that these elite can, convert to Catholicism for their own benefit because you stand to gain from that because you can collaborate with the French that way, and they're smoking opium as a way to just kind of get away from the world and not deal with their problems, and they're suppressing rebellion that way. There's kind of a revolutionary morality here. There's Gabriel Kolko, who wrote Anatomy of a Peace, wrote an earlier book called Anatomy of a War, which I actually think is the best overall book on Vietnam. It's just Kolko's prose is not the easiest in the world to read. And he talks at great length about how the Vietnamese have what he calls revolutionary morality. And this attitude toward drugs is very clearly part of that. If you want to resist the French, if you want to create national liberation, you can't be smoking opium while you do it. It suppresses rebellion. You have to stay clean. You have to be, kind of moral and sober in order to do the political work that you have to do. So Nguyen Dinh Chu really does represent a large, and I would probably assume a majority view, but many others don't. There are a great number of collaborators, and these collaborators tend to be from the Mandarin, the elite class. These are just pictures of 19th century Mandarins. Okay, this is Nguyen Van Thuong, and you can tell. Look, I mean, well, first of all, they're wealthy enough to get a portrait done. All right, and you can tell. They're dressed nicely, sitting in the high back chair and so forth. Very well dressed, very well groomed. This is another one, Phan Thanh Gian. Again, they have shoes, right? I mean, clearly this is not a peasant, right? And I mean, I actually don't know if these guys collaborated with the French. I'm not, these are generic pictures of Mandarins. But you can tell they're quite different, and more likely than not, they had reason to have a different approach than, the Tai Son would, or peasants would, or Nguyen Dinh Chu would. I mean, they have different outlooks on things, yeah.
Could you give the spelling of the poet again? It flashed by really quickly.
Oh, yeah, it's right here, Nguyen Dinh Chu. And again, these are always going to be up on the web page, so you can follow along and go back at any time and look this stuff up. So a lot of Mandarins, people, who look like, if nothing else, Phan Thanh Gian and others, and the intellectual elite collaborate. And this is something else that really rankles a lot of poets and others. It's the intellectuals. Intellectuals, there's always kind of this idea that intellectuals and professors are kind of radical, crazy, oppositional type people, when in fact that's never been the case. It's never been the case in the United States either, despite, kind of the rantings and ramblings of people like Newt Gingrich about all these radical professors. In fact, the intellectual elite generally speaks for the established class. And this is clearly what they're talking about with regard to the collaborators in Vietnam. And in fact, the king who one might think would be a collaborator at the time, Tu Duc, who was the monarch when the French came in, rebuked those collaborators too. The king says, how painful it is. You are not only criminals in the eyes of the court, but also in the eyes of this whole generation. Again, ripping into people who collaborate for their own personal gain with the hated French. Nevertheless, the Vietnamese elite and the Vietnamese court eventually accede to French demands. And throughout the 1860s, 1870s, the French gain more control. They eventually take over the entire lower Mekong Delta. In fact, during this, at this time, the Vietnamese were waiting for orders to fight. And instead of orders to fight, the Vietnamese got a letter of explanation. They were never called into battle as the French go in to gain even more control over the Mekong and Cochin China. The Vietnamese get a letter that says, the empire of our king is antiquated. Our gratitude to our kings has always been profound and fresh, and we cannot forget them now, but now the French have come. We are too weak for them. Our leaders and our soldiers have been defeated. Each fight brings more misery. The French have enormous warships, groups of well-armed soldiers, and heavy cannons. No one can resist them. You, Mandarins and people, can live under French rule. They are only terrible in war, but their flag may not be allowed to fly above the fortress while Phan Thanh Gian is still alive. Phan Thanh Gian was the viceroy of Cochin China, And he actually had to surrender to the French. This pained him deeply. He eventually resigned his post, took poison, again, a case of suicide. On his deathbed, he enjoined his children. He told his children that they should never accept employment or honors from the French, told them to earn their living as simple farmers and avoid the French altogether. So it's quite painful, even for those who are forced to collaborate. So you have clearly in the South, especially, this situation where you have a lot of people collaborating. So while the South was being subdued and a good number of Vietnamese were going along with the French, it's quite a different situation in the North. So you have a juxtaposition here: French control in the South and an uproar in the North. This is an example of the way the French institute control both with culture and with force. This first picture is the cathedral, the Basilica of Notre Dame in Paris. I mean, in Saigon. I'm sorry. What better symbol of Western French society than Notre Dame, right? So this is clearly a case where the French are imposing their culture, establishing their culture, their Catholicism. And if you're a Vietnamese and you want to get along with the French, what better way to do it than to convert? So you start to see a lot of converts, especially among the elite. So on one hand, they do it by culture, by religion, and of course they use force too, cannons and hue. So you have, the Bible on one hand and the gun in the other. And through this, the French are able to, hold sway over Vietnam. They're not popular, but through religion, collaboration, force, and whatnot, they're able to more or less get their way through cannons and basilica and so forth. Right? So while the South is being subdued, though, the situation in the North is far more hectic. You have peasant unrest, which is it's a common thread. You have tribal rebellions, local ethnic groups rebellion. You have Lee restoration movements. You have groups of people who want to bring kind of the imagery of Lee Loy back and cult, what would be considered cults to other national heroes. So the North is somewhat chaotic, somewhat in an uproar. This is an example of that. The French actually attacked a citadel at Hung Ho in the 1880s, and this is a pretty cool drawing of it, artwork regarding it. So while the South is being subdued, in the North you see the French flag here, the Vietnamese attacking, and this garrison and so forth. So the North is kind of in constant states of uprising. So the South is much different. I'm sorry, the French are attacking the Vietnamese citadel, not vice versa. I misspoke there. Tongue-tied. So you see an uproar in the North, much different than the South, and again, it's going to maintain. It's going to be that way for a long time. Amid this, you have one of the first large-scale massacres by the French. While the North has these peasant uprisings and tribal rebellions and all this stuff going on, French merchants are also trying to gain control over the Red River in the north for greater trade with China. Okay, so the French essentially are going to help their merchants out, and they send a delegation with the cooperation of Vietnamese officials in the South, collaborators. They send a delegation to Hanoi to settle this dispute and give French merchants the right to navigate the Red River to China. Well, they also send, it's gunboat diplomacy, they also send a fleet there, and in November of 1873, French forces with naval artillery overran a citadel of 7,000 Vietnamese troops. Now, in this battle, the French only lost one soldier, but they killed about 80 Vietnamese and wounded about 300 more. The French, who had done this, really it wasn't part of a larger plan, pretty much spontaneously, were flushed with victory and decided to kind of go further, and they then overran several provinces in the Red River Delta. So in 1874 then, the French are establishing military control, or trying to establish military control in the north as well, and they are a new threat to the Vietnamese. Their control by that time in Cochin China was fairly clear. But at this time, they kind of expand that. They had sovereignty in the South already. They could trade and they could proselytize throughout Cochin China. They tried to do that throughout the rest of the country, in the Red River Delta in the north especially. The Northerners, the Tonkinese, however, hate the French, and they are not going to give in without a brutal fight. Mayhem results. Throughout the 1870s, you have uprisings, armed brigandage, bandits, attacks, and so on. So throughout the 1870s and 1880s, the French are expanding further throughout Vietnam, but again, not without a fight. So the French are expanding, and ultimately they create French Indochina. And French Indochina is actually 5 areas. They have a formal kind of a colonial relationship in the south, in Cochin China. They have protectorates over Annam, Tonkin, and then ultimately Laos and Cambodia as well. This area collectively is known as French Indochina. It includes all of Vietnam, which at the time is essentially broken into 3 areas administratively: Cochin, China, Annam, and Tonkin, and Cambodia and Laos. And so you start to see this being formalized in the 1870s and 1880s. I mean, the French initially come in 1858. By the mid-1860s, pretty much have control over Vietnam, over the economy and whatnot, and then formally they establish this administrative control by the 1870s and 1880s. Okay? And this becomes French Indochina. Yeah.
Did the French experience rebellions from the Laotians and the Cambodians?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know as much about that. It hasn't been covered as much because, well, you know, no one would know anything about Vietnam if the Americans hadn't fought there. But yeah, I think there's some indication. I mean, a lot of these ethnic groups, you know, there's a great deal of intermixing throughout Indochina. So you have Vietnamese and Cambodian, Khmer, and Vietnam and Lao and Vietnam and Hmong and things like that. So yeah, I mean, I think you generally see that. And the Vietnamese, many of the Vietnamese nationalists especially, had a larger understanding. So they really were trying to create kind of a pan-Indo-Chinese movement where all of these people would be part of one. So yeah, I mean, the French control in those areas wasn't as strong either. Vietnam was the real gem of Indochina. I mean, Cambodia and Laos weren't as you know, appealing, so the level of control was less. Yeah.
Was Thailand included in this officially or unofficially?
In Indochina?
Yes, in French Indochina.
Too big, too hard to. I mean, the French had their hands full with Vietnam. I don't know enough about Thai history. I don't want to say something for fear of being like 180 degrees wrong. I have an idea in my head about Thailand, but my impression is that they were.
Call it a theory.
Yeah, my theory, which probably is 180 degrees wrong, is that I think the Thais probably already had decent relationship. It's a Thai monarchy, and I mean they may have already been somewhat open to the West. I don't know. Of course, this is before, you know, Anna and the King. So what am I saying? It's still Siam at the time, right? All right. So that's the French Indochina is established. Okay. So that's in the 1880s. In 1883, French troops poured into the north en masse. They pour into Annam and Tonkin. Within a year, in the north, 3 kings are disposed or commit suicide. Finally, 1885, a 12-year-old king, King Ham Nhi, takes over. And in 1885, he fled into the mountains and called for resistance against the French, who he referred to as disguised animals. The French, I mean, this is how the Vietnamese felt about the French. White-skinned barbarians, disguised animals. It was not a terribly warm relationship for most Vietnamese. And this lets loose another series of rebellions. I mean, this is starting to sound redundant, isn't it? Peasant rebellions, uprisings, this, that. But this is really the history of the Vietnamese as they fight off foreign invasion and foreign aggression. Soldiers who call themselves soldiers of Nha, again, soldiers of righteousness. This is a symbol, kind of a symbol of the martial spirit. This is called the magical crossbow, an altar to the magical crossbow. Again, part of Vietnamese culture, this idea that the crossbow, the resistance, is something to be revered and cherished. They call upon that. The Vietnamese call upon this resistance to the French. Soldiers of Nha, soldiers of righteousness, begin localized rebellions throughout Tonkin and Annam. I mean, the French, you know, really if they have any greater goals. I mean, they can forget about China right now because they have their hands full in Vietnam alone. I mean, on one hand, it's this beautiful lyrical opposition through poets, and on the other hand, it's brigandage, it's riots, it's uprisings, whatever you want to call them. The tragedy of it was that the Vietnamese fought valiantly, but thousands died ultimately in vain. Ultimately, the French just had much greater technology. Okay? I mean, the Americans had greater technology, but the Vietnamese at the time do have, weapons and air missiles, and they're getting stuff from China and the Soviet Union. But this isn't the case in the 1880s. So it's literally, modern technology versus, people with crossbows and sabers and things like that, cavalry, So thousands die in vain. Ultimately, the king, Hamni, flees the country. He's captured, and he was sent into exile in Algeria, which is another French colony. And again, protests erupt. People are upset that the king has been exiled, and a lot of people protest. So again, this sparks a nationwide series of revolts, and again, much of it because of the effort of poets. One person who studied this has looked at records. He said royal court records of this period are filled with messages from district mandarins being elite, the collaborators, that the people are asking to fight and wanting to fight. And these anti-royal, these anti-Mandarin attitudes are quite sharp in the north, of course, in Tonkin. For example, during a French attack in December of 1883, one royal officer, one collaborator, had opened up the city gates so the French could get in. And a leaflet referred to him as a God-cursed traitor who acted like a worm in one's bones. Court officials who collaborated with the French were called, in graffiti and in protest literature, they were called cowards who were excessively anxious to save their lives. This wasn't the natural order. You were supposed to be pious. You were supposed to have family piety, familial piety. You were supposed to be loyal to the family, and the family is bigger. The family can be the nation. And these people are selling their own folk. They're collaborating and selling them down the river. This leaflet concluded with a poem, and this is a poem about collaborators. We possess our life, but we must know how to give it up. Shall we remain silent and thereby earn the reputation of cowards? So long as there exist people on this earth, we shall exist. As long as there is water, we must bail it out. We must read the proclamation on the victory over the Wu, over the Chinese. We shall follow the example of those who exterminated the Mongols, calling on the tradition, the martial spirit, virility. We don't want to earn the reputation of cowards. It's kind of a macho ethic as well. We cannot allow the French to come in and take control of us. And this is in 1883. So, I mean, this is occurring long before, the French Indochina War, long before the American War. And it's maintaining a tradition that's already been in effect for two millennia. All right? The poets tend to kind of be at the forefront of this. You see a great deal then, you have localized rebellions, it's kind of the same pattern. On one hand, you have physical rebellion, localized rebellions, but on the other hand, you also have what I call poetic resistance. And among the really well-known poets at the time, Nguyen, Tran Te Xuong, and Phan Boi Chau stand out. I'm sure I've just butchered all three of them. Nguyen Nguyen was probably the best known of these poets from the late 1800s. He was kind of a funny guy, a bit clever. He was an administrator. He had passed the exams, but he hated the French and didn't want to work with them. So he essentially kind of pulled a Homer Simpson and went on rehab. He pretended he was ill and couldn't work any longer, so he wouldn't have to participate in the French system. And he, of course, like the others, particularly went after people who collaborated. He couldn't stand people who collaborated with the French, and he wrote a poem mocking them. It was a poem about the French who were about the Vietnamese who were celebrating Bastille Day. Bastille Day is, of course, the French equivalent to the 4th of July, July 14th, their National Independence Day. And there's Vietnamese celebrating Bastille Day, and he can't understand that. So he writes this kind of very mocking, kind of dry yet clever poem. He was kind of slick. He was kind of clever and sly. He wasn't really kind of in your face. So this is his poem. He's, frankly, he's really a wise ass. Firecrackers are resounding. It's Bastille Day. So many waving banners, so many lanterns hung. With bulging eyes, officials' wives gape at a boat race. A funny skit, meanwhile, attracts all of the very young. Many girls cling to swings in a tight embrace, while greedy guys pursue their goal of climbing up the well-greased pole. Whoever organized these games has done a splendid job, yet the more fun that these folks have, the greater the disgrace. How dare they go out and enjoy this celebration of the French after, look what the French are doing to us. Nguyen also wrote a funny poem about a friend of his who, like Nguyen Kin, didn't want to work with the French. This guy was given an appointment to an official post, and he demurred, but he didn't want to come right out and say, I don't do it. So he pretended he was deaf, which is something that people's parents and grandparents always do too. So he said he was deaf and he couldn't work for the French. This was his way out. So they wrote a poem for him to tease him, but at the same time to tease him lovingly and to respect their admiration for him. And Nguyen Quin's poem was called The Man Who Feigns Deafness. There's a man who pretends to be deaf. Huh? What say? He stupidly asks. Little does one suspect he stops and starts his ears like they were plow buffaloes. I'd certainly like to be deaf like that. Amidst the chattering crowd, he sits dumb as a block of wood. But late at night and all alone, he's lively as a monkey. In the back garden, to the front pond, enjoy a pipe, then a chew of betel. 6 or 7 cups of tea while playing with some lines from Q. Who wouldn't want to be deaf like that? But you think it's easy? Just ask him. What say? He'll reply. This is a poem, about resistance. It can be subtle like that. So people like Nguyen Kun, who are scholars but also officials. They're bureaucrats. Like the man who pretended to be deaf to avoid working with the French, were doing a lot more than simply refusing to withhold their support of the French, to withhold their services from the French. They were communicating protest in a very effective way. The French, it's kind of like if you've ever studied slave culture. There's this really effective, subtle protest. Slaves in the United States were considered to be, dumb. So what would they do? Well, they'd, break a machine and then pretend they couldn't fix it on a hot day. So the white overseers would be out there in 100-degree weather trying to fix this while the slaves would be sitting under a tree cooling off, and of course the overseers would say they're so stupid they don't even know what they're doing, and they'd be laughing because in fact this was all part of a plan. And this is kind of what Nguyen Khan is doing. It's kind of a derivative of that. You often see people who don't have power creating their own forms of power relationships. Some sociologists refer to as weapons of the weak, where you can't take them on frontally, you don't have the technology or the firepower to do that, so you find ways around that. You pretend to be deaf, or you feign illness, or you pretend you don't know what's going on here, One thing that working people often do, union people often do in the United States when they're having problems with management, don't want to go on strike, is they work to rules. They work exactly the way the job is written. Because the first thing, if you've ever worked in a plant, you find out how to do things more effectively and faster. And you don't do it the way they tell you to because that takes too long. So if you want to slow down, you do everything by the book. And that's what these people are doing. They're doing everything by the book. And if the French don't understand, they think this guy's deaf. All the Vietnamese are in on the joke. They know this guy isn't deaf, right? And it's part of this inside joke. It's a way of thumbing their noses at the French. Okay, you can't take them on frontally. So you have to do it and find other ways, subtle ways to do it. At the same time, convey the message that these are dangerous people, we don't like them, and we'll do whatever we can to oppose them. We can't take you on yet militarily. We're not strong enough, but we can write poems about you. We can scam you. We can put you on, right? Now, some poets are not quite as dry and acerbic as Nguyen Quin. Tran Te Shuang, for example, was younger, and he was kind of harder hitting. He was more like a Chris Rock rather than Don Rickles or something like that. He was acerbic. He was not as well known either. Tran Te Shuang also, again, all these guys, one of their main targets is the collaborators. They're associates who work with the French, who associate with the French. And he said a lot of his friends who were collaborating were acting in an unnatural and silly way. He said, in winter they use feather fans. In summer they wear socks. Just kind of his way of saying, look at how foolish these people are. He's not coming out saying they're collaborating with the French. He's using this other way to mock them. Tran Te Shuang is also interesting because unlike Nguyen Quin, he failed the exams. He had passed the exam for the low baccalaureate, but not the high baccalaureate, the BA degree national exams. So at one point, they were going to have a big ceremony. The French were going to have a big ceremony for those who passed the high-level exams. They have an award ceremony, and Tron Tae-Shuang has failed them, so he, of course, is not going to receive an award at this ceremony. At the ceremony, the Governor General and his wife, Governor Paul and Madame Paul Dumaire, are there, and they give out pocket watches and a handshake to the successful candidates. So Tron writes a poem about this as a way to kind of get it in, you know, to mock these people who are collaborating with the French, and he's failed this exam. And the poem is called Teasing the Successful Candidates. A flock of those who flunked stood looking on instead. How happy they would have been to receive a pass. Up on the podium, Madam waggled her duck-like ass. Down in the yard, each new BA raised his dragon head. Okay, it's a way of mocking them, and of course mocking the Governor General and his wife as well. Now, there's an interesting story, and when we talk about Ho Chi Minh later, we'll kind of see another derivative of this. Tron Tae-Shuang failed his examinations, but it may not have been solely because he wasn't a good student. He had a habit of kind of getting at the officials who were administering the test. He would write poems and stuff like that about kind of, you know, how young kids would write caricatures and put mustaches on pictures. This is what he would do. So he would often go after the people who were grading his exams with really kind of, you know, hard-hitting poems like that. And he would go after everybody. He really didn't have any respect for authority. He would go after monks, for example. A Buddhist monk near where he lived was arrested on robbery, and he wrote, "All that compassion and still you land in jail? Surely you didn't stray from the path of monastic life. You've chanted prayers of salvation from over 300 books. Maybe you were so busy you forgot the right amulet." So he gets all the monks mad at him. Okay? There were some male shamans, priests, you know, kind of animists, and they claimed they were possessed by the spirits of heroes. And Tron Tae-Shuang wrote, "If you shamans are so clever, why haven't you come to the aid of your nation? You wouldn't be afraid of cannons, would you?" Again, he gets all of them pissed off at him. Excuse me. Despite the fact that he failed the examinations, he continued to read the Chinese classics, but he made fun of it too. What good are Chinese characters? All those PhDs are out of work. Much better to be a clerk for the French. You get milk in the morning and champagne at night. So again, he just mocks everybody. He doesn't really have respect for any kind of authority. But at the same time, he refused to go to school in Hanoi, to a school in Hanoi, which would train him to become an interpreter or a clerk and work for the French. So these soldiers of Nha, that's more than just a person who takes up arms. I mean, it can be a poet. It can be also somebody who responds to the French authority, responds to French control by fighting them on many different grounds. It can be subtle, write a poem. It can be overt, actually pick up arms. Okay? With the French firmly in control, maybe the most famous of these poets emerges Phan Boi Chau. And this is clearly a link to, I don't want to say ancient and modern, that's clearly aren't the case, but this is clearly a link to the Vietnamese of the French period and the Vietnamese of the national period. I mean, Phan Boi Chau was kind of like a, not necessarily a guru, but clearly an icon to people like Ho Chi Minh and those who would take Vietnam deep into the 20th century. With the French firmly in control, Phan Boi Chau emerged. He was a poet, and he was also a political activist who was one of the founders of something called the Travel East movement. So when you talk about Phan Boi Chau, you have to talk about his poetry, but you have to talk also about his goal of creating kind of a pan-Asian movement. And he creates something called the Association for the Modernization of Vietnam. So Phan Boi Chau is part of different things going on at the same time. Okay? He helped establish a Travel East ideology. Right? By the early 1890s, a lot of Vietnamese nationals began to look at Japan as the model for what they could become. Japan was the first Asian nation to modernize. Remember, in 1894, the Japanese fight a major war against the Chinese and rout them. And people are stunned by how powerful Japan looks. And then later, in 1904, 1905, you have the Russo-Japanese War. Russia is a European power, yet what happens in that war? Japan wipes them out. So Japan is a different kind of Asian power. All the stereotypes of Asians don't fit with Japan. So young Asians especially in Vietnam and places like that, look to Japan as the model for the way their country ought to be. By the early 1900s, thousands of Asians, especially from China, something like 3,000 Chinese students are in Vietnam. If you know anything about China, the Boxer Rebellion occurs at the turn of the century, and this is kind of a young nationalist movement. So the kind of thing that's going on throughout Asia is going on in Vietnam as well. And several hundreds of Vietnamese are going to Japan. In Japan, they are trying to get inculcated with the political and ideological skills to come back and create national liberation in their own country. Okay? And Phan Boi Chau is really kind of at the forefront of this travel east movement, meaning we have to be part of a larger Asian movement. We can be like the Japanese. The Japanese don't have to take any stuff from the Westerners. The Japanese stand up on their own right. I mean, during one reason, the Japanese could be quite brutal to other Asian nations throughout the early 20th century, but at the same time, the Asians were kind of admired them because they believed that the white man's days of running Asia were over. The Japanese proved that Asians could compete on that field, at a level the same as the Europeans did. And Phan Boi Chau is one of the founders of this. But he's also a poet, and he's a critic of Vietnamese society, and he, like the others, he attacks collaborators, and he also has a class analysis. He understands the difference between the peasants and the elites, the peasants and the mandarins, those who collaborate and those who can't. So Phan Boi Chau writes a poem. He says, "Why was our country lost? I submit the following. First, the monarch knew nothing of popular affairs. Second, the mandarins cared nothing for the people. And third, the people knew only of themselves. State matters to the king, other affairs to the mandarins," the people said. "Hundreds of thousands, millions together work to build the foundations of our country. The bodies, the resources are from the people. The people are, in fact, the country. The country belongs to the people. On the throne, the king has complete license, and he has a long time to drowse. Within the borders, his word was law. 10,000 people bowed low at his command. Search back and forth over history. Who will restore benefits and wipe out the people's misfortune?" So he's saying, the monarch and mandarin sold us out, but we let them. We slept. Okay? This is our country. We can't let them take it back. So again, most of this poetry isn't really directed at the French so much as the Vietnamese who go along with the French. So Phan Boi Chau believes that it's this internal betrayal and the court's refusal to heed the popular will that lets the French come in. And in Japan, they believe it's different. The people respect each other. The monarch and the people respect each other. So he sets up this Travel East movement, this Association for the Modernization of Vietnam. This also leads to several schools for modernization. One of Phan Boi Chau's close associates, Phan Chu Trinh, actually creates one of the first modernization schools. It was a free school, gave out free books, it had free lessons, anybody could really come to it, to train these young Vietnamese in how to be nationalists, train them in Vietnamese history and culture and that kind of thing. So again, this is a Vietnamization movement. We're a strong, proud Asian people. We don't need Westerners, we don't need French, Europeans coming in and telling us what to do. Okay? Books were printed and distributed to other schools and bookstores free of charge. Enrollment was open. These are like free universities. Faculty donated their time. There were, kind of seminars and teach-ins and that kind of thing. Attempts were made to open classes throughout the country. Lecturers from other parts of Asia would come in and do free lectures and seminars. Phan Chu Trinh was probably the most popular public speaker in Vietnam in the early 1900s. And they're leaders of this group of progressive scholars who shift the debate away from the West versus the East to kind of a modernization movement in Vietnam. What they do is, it may be a misnomer to say they combine the West and East, but what they do is see that Western modernization is not without merit. Education, progress, modernity, if used correctly and if controlled by Asians, that's the key, or if controlled by Asians, if controlled by the people in that country, the indigenous peoples, it can be okay. Now, if the French come in and impose it on you, that's not modernization, that's simply coercion, that's simply empire, that's simply control, that's colonialism. No one wants that. But if we can do this like the Japanese did, I mean, the Japanese aren't colonized, are they? It's the Asian country that's not colonized. The Chinese have the Portuguese in Macau, and the British in Hong Kong, and the Germans in Qingdao, and the Russians in Port Arthur, and Indochina is controlled by the French, and you have other countries, trying to gain footholds in other parts of Asia, the British in India. Not in Japan, though. Japan's different. Japan modernized, but on their own terms. The Japanese modernized on their own terms. So it's modernization, but it's Asian. It's modernity according to their own model. And if the Vietnamese do that, that's okay. We can accept progress, even if it's Western-type progress, but we don't want Western imposition. That's not modernity. Okay? So this is what Phan Boi Chau and Phan Chu Trinh and others do. Okay? And so what they do is they tell the Vietnamese that it's their duty as patriotic and virtuous citizens to get rid of the old way of doing things rather than defend them. The old way, even if it was Vietnamese, when it was Confucian, may not necessarily be right. I mean, look, what's the old way gotten them? The French are in charge now. So we can accept some of the ideas that come from abroad, come from the West especially, if we do it in our own terms. They force people then to contemplate, probably for the first time, that some of these new ways might be worthy of thinking about. These Western ways may not be so bad after all. And this kind of can take on some kind of interesting and humorous overtones as well. At one point, Phan Chu Trinh was giving a speech at a school in Hanoi, and he carefully ended with this big kind of ending, which is kind of ironic, and it shows, again, just how subtle forms of resistance can take. He ends this speech one night by saying, "Several thousand years ago, our people cut off their hair and tattooed themselves." Remember the hung dragon tattoos. "Only when Chow To took over our country did we become infected with Chinese customs. But even then, only a few people in urban centers followed them. It was not until the Ming invaders came in and compelled us to imitate them that our men began to let their hair grow and wore it in a bun, that our women began wearing trousers, and we became Chinese." Japanese is okay, Chinese isn't. "But today, fortunately, heaven has opened our minds. We have awakened, and the entire nation is modernizing. So go out and cut your hair. Don't leave any more land for that stupid gang of parasites to colonize on top of your heads, from which they can suck your blood. Wouldn't it feel wonderful to be rid of them? Don't you think so, don't you?" That's how he ends his speech. Well, people are laughing and they're applauding him. He's talking about a haircut, right? But what this does is create a national movement about cutting people's hairs. It tends to have political significance in the same way that wearing an afro and a dashiki in the 1960s for the black nationalist movement might have. I mean, things like appearance and culture and dress can have an appearance. They're not about fashion. Bell bottoms were initially a political statement until boutiques started selling for like $80 a pair, and it became a fashion thing, right? And that's what happens here. It's this movement to cut your hair tends to have political overtones. So people start chanting the haircutting chant. Comb in the left hand, scissors in the right. Clip away, easy, easy, do it right. Off with stupidity, off with foolishness. Today we snip, tomorrow we shave. See if we can get the Cougar cheerleaders to do that at halftime of the first game, okay? Now the French, actually they're kind of getting smart. They're getting clued in a little bit. They understand that this really isn't about haircuts. This is a political movement. This is a movement, again, to take control of things. Why wear your hair in this outmoded, outdated Chinese style? The French don't wear their hair that way, do they? So the French are suspicious of the implications of this activity, and they call this le mouvement de la tonsure, the movement of the haircutting. They see it as a political movement, okay? And they don't like it, so they understand that there is symbolic a significance here, and they crack down on it. Now, on one hand, they're in this weird situation because they can force people not to cut their hair. You can't really do that, but they're really suspicious of these Vietnamese who are now wearing their hair short in somewhat of a more westernized style, rather than the kind of long hair in the bun that was traditional at the time. Okay, one poet actually talked about this relationship between being patriotic but adhering to traditional values. And sometimes adhering to traditional values is not necessarily the best thing. So this poet, Nguyen, Nguyen Dinh Chu, who we talked about earlier, says, I would rather face eternal darkness than see the face of traitors. Being blind but knowing how to uphold family virtues is better than having eyes but neglecting one's ancestors. Being blind and keeping one's body and mind intact is better than having eyes but having to cut hair and trim the beard. So this guy is wavering on this, and you can see the Vietnamese cultural elite is quite upset about this whole thing too. So it was against this backdrop that these haircuts became an incredibly powerful political symbol. I mean, you know, it sort of sounds silly, the Le Mouvement de la Tonsure, but in fact, one of the major political movements of the early 20th centuries has to do with these haircuts. Because this was a symbol that you weren't going to do things the old way. And this was clearly a way of saying to the Vietnamese collaborators, you know, the mandarins, the elites, that your way is no better than the French. You know, we will take on the best of both.
Well, I was just thinking, I mean, if you look at the whole 1960s, hair in the 1960s of the United States, and whether you were black, white, green, or yellow, the growing of your hair was socially and culturally significant to in fact say down with the old, that this is the new way, and we're going to do it this way, and the heck with you, you know, and...
Oh, sure, and it's the biggest play of the 60s, his hair. One of Malcolm X's epiphanies is when he quits straightening his hair and lets it go natural. I mean, yeah, stuff like that, you know, in an isolated way may not mean a whole lot, but when it becomes part of a larger process and becomes a way of kind of thumbing your nose at certain groups of people, yeah, it actually is a very potent symbol, and that's what happens. And so you have this haircut movement and these free schools. Clearly the French are balking. I mean, the French understand that there's something going on here. Like Dylan says, you don't know what it is, do you, Mr. Jones? I mean, they weren't really sure what was going on, but they knew something was, all right? And they balked. I mean, they didn't like the way that these schools, these free schools were taken off. They didn't like this Vietnamese modernization. They didn't like this haircutting movement at all. So they cracked down. One popular poem said, now is the time to shave our head and become monks, to chant the prayer of independence in the temple of modernity, to pray, to supplicate tirelessly day and night for the benefit of the nation, for the benefit of the people. Become monks to open the minds of the people. Become monks to make our country rich and strong. So again, it's a way of combining East and West. Being a monk's okay, but modernity is okay too. Cut your hair, that's okay, but be Vietnamese at the same time. So these things all kind of merge, and so you have a fairly potent movement. Now, the French are not threatened. You know, I mean, their French rule is not threatened. The French still have power. They have coercion, but they don't have culture. I mean, there are interesting ways to rule. I mean, clearly you can rule by the gun, and that's probably the easiest way to rule in some regard. You can use coercion and force, but effective rule often rests upon culture, by creating institutions that people accept, and by essentially convincing people that what you're doing is in their best interests. And the French never did that. I mean, the French could use coercion and force, and they could get collaborators, but they never, ever came close to instituting a culture in Vietnam, a French culture in Vietnam. I mean, the majority of people remained Buddhist. Catholics were always held in some suspicion. Even though they ran the country, I mean, the elite tended to be predominantly Catholic, especially when you get into the 1960s and the Dinh Diem years. The majority of people never accepted Catholicism as their a religion. So the French are never able to use culture as a way of ruling. They could never convince the Vietnamese people to be French, Francicized or Francisized or whatever, however you would say it. Oops. So they have to use force. They have to use coercion. And when you use coercion, you know who your enemy is. You know what they're doing to you. Culture is more subtle, and it's harder to detect when somebody is imposing a cultural hegemony on you than it is when when people are firing at you and using cannons and making you do corvée labor. You know who the enemy is, and it's easier to attack them either subtly or directly. But if they can convince you that the way they're doing things is in your best interest, then you've got something else going on. It's a lot harder. I mean, if you can convince a bunch of poor people, a bunch of people who don't have land, who are poor peasants, if you can convince them that the way you're doing things is really for their benefit, then, you've got something going there. But the French don't do that. They're not capable of doing that. They never really attempt to do it. And the Americans don't really do it either. There's really this sense that Vietnamese society and Vietnamese culture just don't really matter that much. So there's an imposition, a coercion, a control. And you see that up to 1900, and the Vietnamese resist. subtly through poetry, through haircutting, or with all these, really Pyrrhic attempts, to attack them. I mean, guerrilla actions and uprisings and so forth, which are quite tragic, but also, quite indicative of how far the Vietnamese are willing to go and how patient they will be. Okay? So we're kind of up to the 20th century now. And in the 20th century, Vietnamese history becomes incredibly complex and incredibly important. It leads ultimately to the Vietnam War, which really, is one of the major events in its own way of the 20th century. It may not have been a world war like the Great War or World War II, but in its own way, it was a transformative event like those. The Vietnam War in American history is crucially important. It clearly takes the United States, which is ascendant and creating an empire based on certain particular structures and forms, and it changes things dramatically. So 20th century Vietnamese history is real important, not just for the Vietnamese, of course, but for the Americans as well. Whenever you talk about Vietnamese history, you have to start by talking about Ho Chi Minh, whose name I don't have up there because I was trying to be clever. I say the education of Nguyen Ai Quoc. Ho Chi Minh, who's kind of the most important figure without a doubt in, well, probably all of Vietnamese history, but certainly 20th century Vietnamese history, actually went by many, many different names throughout his life. One of the most common was Nguyen Ai Quoc, which roughly translated meant Nguyen the Patriot. I mean, he probably had 30 different aliases going. Ho Chi Minh was another alias, which essentially means, Ho, the patriot, the man of Vietnam, something like that. I'm sure you've all seen him a million times. There's a picture of Ho as a young man, which I wanted to get. You're probably more familiar with him. He's about 5 foot tall, 100 pounds, very frail, very small. People refer to him as Uncle Ho. It was a way, again, that family piety, that idea that the nation is a family. So we'll call him Uncle Ho. And he was very, very clever, very slick. He would often have pictures taken, with flowers, a bead of flowers around him, or with children at his feet. He almost reminds you of Timothy Leary or somebody like that. So that's Nguyen Ai Quoc, Ho Chi Minh. And the emergence of Ho Chi Minh and his nationalist and communist ideology really is crucial to 20th century Vietnamese history. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about him. By the early 1900s, 1910, 1920, the older generation of Vietnamese nationalists, people like the poets we just talked about, were aging and dying off, and they were giving way to a younger and more militant group. Now the poets, in their own right, were quite militant, but they were very subtle too, writing poems. But this new group is going to take this a step further. They're going to be more militant, more activist. And these young militants are going to be inspired not necessarily by the heroes of Vietnam, Lady True or the Trung sisters or Trung Huy Dao, although they will certainly invoke them, but by more contemporary figures, more contemporary political radicals like Vladimir Lenin and the Russian anarchist Bakunin, and especially the Chinese nationalist Sun Yat-sen. And they are going to look to these radicals, these communists, these nationalists, as the model for the way they do things. And at the forefront of this movement was a young man who at the time was going by the name Nguyen Ai Quoc, later Ho Chi Minh. He was born in 1890, and he was at birth named either Nguyen Sin Kung or Nguyen Tat Tan. Not really sure. I've seen so many different names for Ho Chi Minh. He was born in Annam in Nha An province. That's the home province is Nghean, and it's in Annam. It's in the central area of Vietnam, Nha An. Okay. Not surprisingly, Annam is a seat of rebellion. The Annamese and the Tonkinese never liked the Chinese or the French. They, were tended to be fairly rebellious throughout that whole period. And Annam, of course, has a tradition of anti-French resistance already by the time Ho is a young boy in the 1890s and early 1900s. In fact, in 1899, the legend goes Ho Chi Minh sat at the feet of Phan Boi Chau and heard him recite his nationalist poetry and talk about collaborators in the French and so forth. He clearly, almost definitely, heard family discussions about nationalist issues. His father, talk about briefly, was fairly political. In fact, Ho's family moved from Nha An to Hue so that his father could prepare for bureaucratic examinations, the Confucian system. His father was fairly well-to-do, and again, I mean, he kind of some parallels to like Fidel Castro. Fidel came from a very good family. He himself was a lawyer. Ho Chi Minh was a Ho Chi Minh's father was a district magistrate in Binh Dinh province, so he was fairly well-to-do. He was up there, living comfortably by working for the French. So Ho moves to Hue so his father can prepare for these examinations, and in Hue he meets other young Vietnamese like himself who don't really like what the French are doing. Ho is also affected by, I mentioned corvée labor earlier. The French decide to take a bunch of people from Nguyen province to do corvée labor on a road project, and a lot of people Ho grew up with are killed and maimed and injured while doing corvée labor. The work is hard. They're not really given provisions. There's no shelter. There's no safety. There's no OSHA, of course. No medical care or anything like that. So the attrition rate on all corvée labor projects is quite high. Now his family is quite well-to-do, so they don't do corvée labor, but he sees that and he doesn't like it. It really kind of affects his conscience and his sense of justice and decency. At Hue, Ho's father loses his job. Now, some French officials claim that, well, they actually trumped up charges. Basically, they claimed that he was an alcoholic and he was embezzling funds. But in fact, French officials later, they found documents which indicated that Ho's father, Ho Chi Minh's father, was dismissed from his civil service position because he was a nationalist. He didn't like the French, and because he refused to learn French. Well, I mean, it's going to be hard to, if you refuse to write in French, then you're not going to have a job with the French administration. So his father is very similar. You know, his father is politicized. It wasn't, you know, a real coincidence then that Ho turned out the way he did. While Ho was a young boy, Phan Boi Chau, who knew Ho's father, tried to talk him into sending Ho, Nguyen Sin Kung at the time, to train in Japan or in China, part of this travel lease movement. But instead, Ho's father enrolled him in an academy at Hue, where he would learn in the traditional French field of studies. While at Hue, Ho was deeply affected when the French suppressed the tax rebellion violently, which is the way they did things, and his father lost his job. At that point, Ho quit school and went down to coach in China. Then he became a merchant seaman, and for 2 years he traveled the world. He spent World War I. He was in New York for a brief time. He was in London for a while. And then he ends up in Paris. And it was in Paris that Ho really kind of matured politically. Paris became the center for the Vietnamese expatriate community. Okay? He began associating with people on the French left and with Asian and Vietnamese nationalists in Paris who had similar ideas about the justice of the world, about colonialism, imperialism, and things like that. The joke goes that Ho, there was actually Ho, the rumor was that Ho worked as a pastry chef while he was in Paris, and the joke is that he was fired because he refused to bake Napoleons. I didn't say it was a funny joke, I said it was a joke. But at any rate, while in Paris, he hooks up with French lefties and Vietnamese nationalists. And this is really going to be important because when Ho's program takes shape, I mean, the Americans are always going to say he was a commie, he was a puppet of Mao Zedong, da-da-da. And there were going to be people who defended Ho by saying, oh, no, he was a nationalist. Well, he was both. Okay, it's like the old Saturday Night Live thing. It's a dessert topping and a floor wax. He was a nationalist and a communist. Okay? And this is clear from the first. He's associating with the French left, with the PCF, the Parti Communiste Français, the French Communist Party. And he's also associating with Asian nationalists who, you know, are kind of shying away from the communist ideology, but like communists because they are anti-imperialist, because they're anti-colonial. So with other Vietnamese nationals in Paris, and now these are the World War I years too, so the world really is in chaos and disarray, Ho draws up a program for the emancipation of Vietnam. And in 1919, the story is that Nguyen Ai Quoc rents a tuxedo. And because he's so small, this tuxedo is very ill-fitting, puts on a big top hat, and goes to the gate at Versailles. What's happening at Versailles? 1919? The Treaty of Versailles, the conference to end World War I, and asks to meet Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson's been talking about, an end to empires and anti-imperialism and whatnot. And Ho Chi Minh, nguyen Quoc, wants to meet him and say, hey, help us get our independence in Vietnam. Well, little does Ho know that Wilson doesn't mean independence and anti-colonialism for yellow people. He's talking about the Ottoman Empire, the Balkans, the Turks, people like that. He's not talking about people in Africa and Asia. Wilson's fine with that kind of colonialism. He just doesn't think white Europeans ought to be in a colonial relationship like they are with the Habsburgs or the Ottomans and the Balkans, places like that. But Ho doesn't know that. Wilson, is not really being real candid about that, so Ho tries to see him. And of course, never gets an audience because he wants to present Woodrow Wilson with this program for Vietnamese independence and ask Wilson for his support. Ho Chi Minh always really had fairly good feelings about the United States. He thought the U.S., he'd read the Declaration of Independence, we'll talk about that later, fairly good feelings about the U.S., thought the U.S. was a model. The American War for Independence and America's own democratic system really impressed him. Okay? He was calling himself Nguyen Quoc at the time, Nguyen the Patriot. At that time, he also joined, as I said, the PCF, the French Communist Party. He joined the Comintern, the Communist International Movement. He attended meetings in Moscow. He goes to study in the Soviet Union. In Moscow, he was appointed by the Comintern, by the Russians, to go to China, where he was supposed to organize a League of East Asian Oppressed Peoples, a larger Asian nationalist movement, kind of like Phan Boi Chau was talking about the Travel East movement, but this would be communist-based as well as nationalist. Okay, and the communists are trying to play the national card as well as the class card. Okay. Many Vietnamese began to train in China. One of the great ironies is that they trained at a place called Whampoa Military Academy. The Whampoa Military Academy, where the Vietnamese and Ho Chi Minh was, had as students Chiang Kai-shek and Zhou Enlai, who would later become blood rivals in the Chinese Civil War. So Ho is part of this mix, this incredibly rich mix at Whampoa. So he's a radical in China. He's creating this new Vietnamese nationalism, and he's dabbling in communism. So by 1910, 1920, the 1920s, Ho Chi Minh is poised to create a modern Vietnam, a new Vietnam, with national liberation, with independence, and with a goal toward creating a country that can stand on its own, that won't have the Chinese or the French or anybody else telling them what to do. Okay? So that's Ho up to that point. We'll spend more time talking about him next week and then do some background on the U.S. As we move along. Okay.